So good morning, everybody. I want to welcome everyone to the, what are we now, the fifth meeting of the Firenze San Diego Symposium on Decline. We're really excited to have everyone here. And again, I mean, just to reiterate what the project represents, this is a product of a partnership that the University of Florence and UC San Diego have established to work together on topics related to antiquity. And what we decided is that the Zoom experience offered us a really unique opportunity to put together a series of lectures and seminars from both Italian and other European scholars, and then also UC San Diego and other American scholars, to exchange ideas about what decline represented in antiquity and what we as scholars can do to examine this as a concept. And so what we also have done is tried to enhance the partnership by assigning, in a sense, moderators from Italy to control the discussion and the introductions of speakers from the United States, and moderators from the United States to do the same for Italian papers. And so today I'm very happy to turn things over to Barbara Del Giovanni, who is going to talk about, or going to introduce our speaker today, Ted Kelting.
Hi to everybody. I am Barbara Del Giovanni. Can you hear me? Yes, everything is fine. Okay, I'm happy to present the speaker of today, Edward Ted Kelting, who is an assistant professor of Mediterranean study at the UC San Diego. Edward received his PhD in classics from Stanford University in 2019, and his AB in Egyptology and classics from Brown University in 2012. His research, which is very interesting, investigates cultural translation in the Roman imperial world. Is working on a book project. The provisional title is Egypt and the Birth of the Roman Empire, in which we highlight the agency Egyptians had in articulating Egyptian cultural forms to a Greek and Roman audience. Other research topics include non-human animal characters in metamorphosis and fable, ancient and modern ethnography, the Afrocentrist reception of pharaonic Egypt, and new approaches to fragmentary literature. Ted published a very interesting article on Juvenal Satire 15 on Egyptian topic, and also another article on American Journal of Philology on Apuleius' Metamorphosis. So I'm looking forward very much to hearing his paper and the speech of Edward Kelting. Thank you very much.
Now I'm unmuted. Okay, thank you all for coming. And thank you, Barbara, for the very warm introduction. It is my kind of, I do the thing that we're all doing, which is making sure you can see my PowerPoint and can hear me, but I'll do it anyway. All right, great. So thank you to everybody in San Diego who are at the bitter end of a very long academic year, and those in Florence who were brave enough to hear a talk on Tacitus on a Friday night. More power to you. And finally, thanks especially to Ed and Giovanni for inviting me. As many of you probably know, I'm very new to the UCSD community, so it's great to participate in this vibrant collaboration. My talk today focuses on the intellectual authority of the tour guide. And like many of you, I'm sure, I've been at an ancient site or at a museum and overheard the creative, let's say, interpretations that tour guides can offer to their audience. And in that vein, I want to open my talk today by considering what makes a good tour guide. So to answer that question, I went to the internet, and particularly the authority on such things, TripAdvisor, where there were many, many opportunities to reflect on what constitutes the success or the failure. And there were plenty of failures, apparently, of the tour guide. My talk's title suggests, and it is true, that I'll be talking about Egypt as an object of touristic fascination for the adopted son of Tiberius, one Germanicus. Unsurprisingly, reviewers on the internet have a lot to say about the ups and downs of Egyptian tour guides. So here's one of them, a good one, 5 stars. Gad is the very best of guides. You want someone who is knowledgeable, but who also makes the information accessible. And this is Gad. Our group was quite a spiritual one, and he coped very well with us. The highlight for me was his tour of the Serapeum at Saqqara, where he did not simply trot out the quote-unquote party line, but was willing to accept that there were mysteries and things that cannot be explained. At all times, he was friendly, funny, and approachable, and absolutely enhanced our tour. I only wish he had been available to our trip to the pyramids, as our guide there was terrible. It's worth singling out briefly what makes this tour guide, Gad, so spectacular, so 5-star. The reviewers focus on accessibility, demarcates a space of arbitration and mediation that constitutes a guide's particular value. The guide needs to know how to form a bridge that connects the Serapeum to those who are in the present. So too does the reviewer suggest that the particular needs of an audience should shape the way that the guide goes about this mediation between past and present. Most importantly, and kind of provocatively, the reviewer points to the potential for a point of rupture between past and present. He makes clear that some things in the past are inexplicable. And in this reviewer's eyes, acknowledging that rupture is the mark of a guide who is a cut above. The reviewer here uses the verb accept to make clear that this specter of historical rupture between present and past is not something to be taken on in a cheery way. But so too does it form a path by which guides, like Gad, can position themselves above an otherwise unsatisfactory and generic recapitulation of the past, something that he calls the party line. This evaluation of the tour guide, with its emphasis on mediation, on audience, and the tenuous connection between present and past, helps foreground the relevant issues that frame the ancient tour of Egypt that I'm going to be talking about today. So to zoom out and introduce myself to this collaboration, let's say. This is an offshoot of one strand of my research, one that looks at the role of Egypt and Rome's coming to terms with the institution of the Principate. And in that project, I argued that Egypt, as the place where Antony and Cleopatra died and the place where Octavian finally concluded the Civil War, becomes irreconcilably connected to the genesis of the Principate, whether for good or for bad. And this Augustan coin with its legend, Aegypto Capta, is just one way that Augustus went about repackaging civil war as imperial annexation and expansion. Egypt then takes on a dual function depending on a particular Roman author's relationship to the Principate. It can either be the cause of and historical antecedents for Rome's decline into tyranny and corruption, or it can provide an historical archetype for the kind of empire that Rome adopts and then perfects. Tacitus, whom I'm going to be talking about today, and is here represented among some of his contemporaries in this, I just couldn't help including it. It's so pretty. It's a mural from Scotland's National Galleries. Tacitus is closer to the former type of Roman author, the one not so happy about this move. But Tacitus's resigned acceptance of the Principate is a slippery thing. And Tacitus scholars have wrestled with where to place Tacitus on the spectrum drawn out between these two poles, the one celebratory of the Principate and the other lamenting of it. That brings me to today and to decline. The argument I'd like to propose today is that the latter view, right, one of the Principate as a decline, is particularly ripe for historiographic authority and intervention. In other words, decline is good business for historians because it allows them to single out their expertise and value. I'm going to be diving into that general issue through one very specific passage in the Annales, when Tiberius's adopted son, presumptive heir, and implicit rival, Germanicus, pictured here in a British Museum bust with a defaced forehead, and here with a coin circulated by Caligula, his son and the future emperor, when Germanicus takes a break during his time managing the East to visit Egypt and see the sights. Within that visit, he makes a stop at Thebes, where a priest is asked to read a monument for Germanicus's benefit. And thank you for your forbearance. This is the most intimidating thing I can offer in a PowerPoint, this long passage, but it's the crux of my talk, so I really do have to read it. There still remained on the piles of masonry Egyptian inscriptions giving a summary of the city's earlier wealth. One of the senior priests was instructed to translate his native language, and he reported that 700,000 men of military age had once lived in Thebes. It was with such an army, he said, that King Ramses had taken control of Libya, Ethiopia, the Medes, and the Persians, and Bactria and Scythia, as well as all the lands inhabited by the Syrians and the Armenians, and by their neighbors, the Cappadocians. Ramses' empire had comprised the area from Bithynia on one side to the Lycian Sea on the other, said the priest. The lists of the tribute imposed on the various nations could also be read: the weight of silver and gold, the quantity of weapons and horses, the gifts of ivory and perfumes for the temples, and the amounts of grain and all other provisions that each people had to contribute. These were all no less impressive than the duties now levied by the might of Parthia or the power of Rome. Germanicus's visit to Egypt offers a portrait in miniature of the potential value of the past for those in power. Like our 5-star tour guide Gad, the priest here exercises a knowledge of his people's past tailored to his audience, a Claudian dynast and presumptive heir to power. Germanicus is, as I'm going to be discussing presently, an ideal audience for that knowledge. But as the fragmented state of the Theban monument shows, this kind of knowledge is deliberately located in a site of ruin, one that constantly threatens obliteration, right? The kind of rupture between past and present that must, per our enthusiastic TripAdvisor reviewer, be reckoned with. To put it simply, there is a boiled down moment of historiographic teaching here. Located in a site that is associated with the genesis of the Principate, and that's transacted between an ersatz historian and a member of the imperial family, one who's singled out for his particular keenness for remembering the past and guiding his actions on its basis. The Roman tourist, the literary pedigree of the Egyptian setting, and the monument's translator combine to set up an idealized picture of decline's intellectual profitability when arbitrated by the right person for the right recipient. But this idealized picture resides unsteadily within its setting in the Annales, right before Germanicus's death, which is the next episode in Germanicus's biography in the Annales. Okay. So Germanicus's visit begins the conclusion to his arc in the Annales, and the visit to Egypt needs to be set against the wider suite of books 1 to 2 of the Annales, which is anchored on Tiberius's entrance into power in the way that he establishes the patterns that are, in Tacitus's view, constitutive of the Principate. So just as a kind of review for those who don't have the Annales at the front of their head, Germanicus opens by handling really badly the mutinies of the German legions that occur when Augustus dies. Then things transition and Germanicus starts to actually fight the war in Germany. And in book 2, Germanicus starts to be very successful in his management of that war. But critically, he's about to be able to offer up the final battle, maybe one more year, but Tiberius recalls him and then sends him out to the east. And it's in the east that he tries to handle an Armenian succession. That was the object of that coin by Caligula. But he's constantly undermined by his second in command, a guy named Gnaeus Piso. And Piso is, according to Tacitus, probably taking instructions from Tiberius to make Germanicus's life unpleasant. That leads to the Egypt visit, and then soon thereafter to Germanicus's death, where Piso gets blamed. The Egypt visit caps and thus explains the distinct and divergent characterizations of Germanicus in books 1 to 2. And this is relatively well known. Basically, Germanicus evolves from a real moron in book 1, that's putting it bluntly, but his management of this mutiny in book 1 is very clumsy. And then in book 2, he becomes a war hero and a beloved popularis. so that by the time that Germanicus ends up in Egypt to see its antiquities, readers are assured that he's one of the few characters who could benefit from it. And he grows over the course of books 1 to 2. Germanicus's interest in the past is highlighted at the very outset of his arrival into Egypt. In the consulship of Marcus Solanus and Lucius Norbanus, Germanicus left for Egypt to acquaint himself with its antiquities. The pretext given, however, was his concern for the province, and he did, in fact, lower the price of grain by opening up the granaries and take up many crowd-pleasing practices. He would walk out without military escort, with feet uncovered and dressed just like the Greeks, in emulation of Publius Scipio, who, we have been told, used to do the same thing in Sicily, although the war with the Carthaginians was still raging. Tacitus opens with a long-standing historiographic distinction between appearance and reality, one that goes back to Thucydides. He includes both the true and the only superficial motivation for Germanicus's actions. And this is highlighted at the outset. He does so to acquaint himself with its antiquities, in this genitive phrase, cognoscendi antiquitatis. On one level, then, there's a touristic impulse to see old things, and it paints a portrait of Germanicus that is deeply retrospective. This continues on in his emulation of Publius Scipio, right? He's dressing like the locals, just like Publius Scipio did. Germanicus's imitation of the Greek dress of this Republican Roman, Publius Scipio Africanus, shows that he embodies this love of the past. There is then, in his imitation of Scipio, a combined sense of respect for local traditions and a keen adoption of Republican practices. This mode of imitation builds on a proliferation of models on which Germanicus patterns his actions. And more than for other characters in books 1 to 2, Germanicus is deliberately a self-conscious imitator of his predecessors. And there are a bunch. The first is Julius Caesar. And early in his character arc, Germanicus's own attempts to quell a mutiny are explicitly positioned in imitation of Julius Caesar, whom he cites to his soldiers. And Germanicus here gives a speech that cites first Caesarian and then Augustan precedent. The deified Julius checked a mutiny in his army with a single word, addressing as Quirites men who refused the oath of allegiance to him. The deified Augustus petrified the legions at Actium with the look upon his face. I am not yet in their company, but I am descended from them. Here, Germanicus creates a chain of exemplarity for dealing with mutinies, one that extends from Caesar through Augustus down to himself. Germanicus is also frequently positioned against Republican exemplars, and I've already named one, Publius Scipio, which is the most obvious. But Tony Woodman has broadened the net of Republican Romans that Germanicus's Eastern tour imitates. And specifically, he's made a convincing case that there are echoes here with Aemilius Paulus Macedonicus, another Republican Roman who makes an Eastern tour. Finally, we get Alexander the Great, the most paradigmatic comparison. And Germanicus's early death in the East, along with his young age, cements this comparison to Alexander the Great. Right? There are those who made comparisons with the death of Alexander the Great based on his looks, his age, the manner of his passing, and even the proximity of the region in which he perished. Already in Book 1, Germanicus is singled out for imitating Alexander, in particular during the Battle of Idiovisa. And in that battle, Germanicus fights without a helmet, which is something that Alexander himself was famous for. And here's an example of that from the famous Alexander mosaic in the House of the Faun from Pompeii. In all cases, Germanicus is a character who has an overabundance of models. And it's important not to get bogged down debating which of these three types of models is the most important. Instead, it's the multiplicity of models that's the key takeaway. This interest in the past also includes Germanicus's passion for monuments and his interest in commemoration. This is obvious in the case of Egypt, where he carves out time to visit iconic monuments like the pyramids and like the statue of Memnon. But even before Egypt, it's clear that Germanicus is singularly interested in monuments. And during his campaign in Egypt, the death of Quinctilius Varus in the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, right, the iconic Roman military defeat, is something that overhangs Germanicus's activity in Germany. So in Book 2, after Germans had destroyed a monument that he had built to Varus in Book 1, all of a sudden we get a kind of return to the scene of the action, right? It reads, they had, however, demolished the mountain, they being the Germans, recently erected to commemorate Varus's legions, as well as an altar consecrated to Drusus. Germanicus reestablished the altar and led a parade of his troops in his father's honor, but decided against rebuilding the mound. The parade here hints at a broader framework of commemoration than physical monuments alone. And as Tony Woodman notes, Germanicus later encourages his Roman soldiers to battle through the specific language of monumental commemoration. And just to emphasize, this is a speech that's given in indirect discourse. The Elbe is now closer than the Rhine, and there would be no fighting beyond it as long as they made him the victor in that very region where he was treading in the footsteps of his father and his uncle. And it's important to note the translation from, I think, Yardley that I've included here doesn't quite render this victorem sisterent, which is really a kind of technical term for raising a victory monument, right? Standing a victory. It's deliberately monumental, in other words. One's reminded time and again of Germanicus' singular focus on vestigia, right? These footprints of his father and uncle, right? The traces of the past which guides his actions, in this case, somewhat literally. His own virtue becomes a self-imagined monument, one that can commemorate those who are long dead. Egypt is just one place in Germanicus's eastern trip that is marked out for its historical value. And Germanicus and his insubordinate subordinate Piso both visit Athens, and they do so very differently. Germanicus enters into the city with suitable deference for Athens' historical importance. Right? So where respect for the treaty with his city, allied to us and of great antiquity, led him to make use of only one lector, which is very nice. And then also we get the Greeks drawing attention to Athens' historical deeds. So Germanicus enters into the city really in an unpompous way, one that shows respect for Athens' historical importance. And this deference to the local anticipates his local address in Alexandria. This is a character trait. He respects the local. His commemoration of Athens' glory is loudly contrasted with the brash entrance of his rival, Gnaeus Piso, which occurs soon afterwards. Gnaeus Piso cowed the citizens of Athens by his tumultuous arrival and then berated them in a savage address. In this, he launched a sidelong attack on Germanicus for dishonoring the Roman name by his excessive affability towards a people who were not really the Athenians. Those had been wiped out by the many disasters, but merely a trashy collection of various tribes. Right? That conluviam illam nationum is really pretty striking. So Piso's entrance to Athens is predicated on singling out the rupture between the Athenian past and this trashy collection of those in the present. The latter are irrevocably disconnected from their former glory. And Piso here makes explicit a tacit threat of illegitimacy that hangs over attempts by those in the present to claim authority over the past. By the time that Germanicus arrives in Egypt, his enthusiasm, sorry, I think I might be blurry. No, I'm okay. By the time that Germanicus arrives in Egypt, his enthusiasm for the past and his readiness to shape his own itinerary around it are unambiguous. The narrative has made clear that learning about Egypt truly is a culmination of Germanicus's past-mindedness. But the opening of the passage quickly turns away from this true motivation and the real Germanicus to a set of Egyptian resonances which are not what marks out Germanicus's real reasons for visiting Egypt. Right? The pretext given, however, was his concern for the province, and he did in fact lower the price of grain by opening up the granaries. This turn to grain pivots to a politicized rather than historicized Egypt. And through this reference to grain, Tacitus underlines Egypt's pivotal role in the maintenance of the Principate. As Christopher Pelling has shown, the expected order of pretext and real motivation are here inverted. Most would use antiquities as a pretext for a real desire to use Egypt as a launching pad toward the Principate. But for Germanicus, it's exactly the opposite. Already the qualities that make Germanicus an almost impossibly ripe candidate for a moderated form of the Principate, his love of the past, his connections to the crowd, simultaneously prove that he will never become a princeps. Right? That would require his Egyptian motivations to be reversed. This switched set of motivations bolsters the broader irony of Germanicus's positive traits. The thrust of Book 1 revolves around Germanicus's almost inept refusal to vie for power, and Tacitus emphasizes this over and over again. At the outset, Tacitus singles out Germanicus's potential for power, even as Germanicus throws his support behind Tiberius. And we get this in a typical correlative clause, this quanto tanto. The closer Germanicus came to the prospect of supreme power, the more he exerted himself on Tiberius's behalf. This extends to his rather bad handling of the mutiny that first basically introduces Germanicus is initially motivated by their troops' desire to march on Rome and take power for Germanicus. Right? These troops indicated their support if he, Germanicus, wanted supreme power. But with that, as if tainted with their crime, Germanicus leapt hastily from the dais. And this is typical of the kind of wrought Germanicus of Book 1. Germanicus only bungles his treatment of the mutiny because he refuses to go along with this plot, using troops to march on Rome. Even though this plot becomes the canonical way for future emperors to take power, particularly in 69 CE onward, the stuff covered in the histories. Through adoption, finally, Germanicus becomes the brother to Tiberius's biological son, Drusus. The narrative sets up a rivalry for the succession between the two. But Germanicus doesn't play that game. He's consistently loving of Drusus and constantly offers his support for him. And the feeling is apparently reciprocal. The brothers had an exceptionally harmonious relationship. In all cases, Germanicus naively does the right thing. And in all cases, subsequent history will show a string of Roman leaders who are successful precisely because they are immoral enough to do all of the things that Germanicus refuses to. So the very presence of Germanicus in Egypt represents in miniature the threat he's supposed to, but doesn't maybe actually pose to Tiberius. Tiberius is not thrilled that Germanicus is in Egypt. Tiberius used some gentle words of rebuke for his appearance and dressing like a Greek, but was bitingly critical of him for entering Alexandria without the emperor's authorization, which was a breach of the practice established by Augustus. For amongst the various arcane policies of his regime, Augustus had one by which he kept Egypt in isolation, forbidding entry to senators or eminent Roman knights unless they had his permission. This was to prevent anyone from putting pressure on Italy with food shortages by establishing himself in the province and holding the key access points to it by land and sea, for there he could hold back mighty armies with the flimsiest of forces. What had been a general tension between a jealous Tiberius and a popular Germanicus is positioned against the precedent set by Augustus. And from the outset, Augustus had been protective of Egypt and the prestige it could offer. And I can't talk about it right now for time, but there are a lot of Cornelius Gallus resonances here, and I'd be happy to talk about that. As a result, any entrance into Egypt was inevitably read as a form of challenge to the princeps. The lessons from the past that Germanicus learns in Egypt is going to be inevitably read as a form of challenge to Tiberius. Once Germanicus's noble motives have been colored by this tension with Tiberius, Tacitus launches into the substance of his tourism. I won't read this, but he just starts by touring around the mouths of the Nile. And these mouths are named after kind of mythological Greek episodes. First, the Canopic branch, which is named after Menelaus, his helmsman, and then to the Heracles branch, which we get another kind of parenthesis about its kind of, apparently Hercules is an Egyptian guy. At the outset, then, Tacitus emphasizes the points of connection between Egyptian history and the Greek past, and the fact that these branches are named after Hercules and Canopus. Through this reference to Homer via Menelaus and this Odyssey 4 kind of legacy of Menelaus ending up in Egypt, Tacitus inaugurates a particular version of Egypt's sites that's markedly referential to other authors' work. The view of Thebes offered by the priest aligns with the vision of Theban wealth offered in the Homeric poems. This version of Thebes that the priest gives is very 100 Gates-y. right? Very Homeric. So this importance of Homer's vision of Thebes for the priest's account makes clear that Tacitus's Egypt directly engages with other authors' use of Egypt. These pit stops around the Nile Delta build to Germanicus's visit to Thebes, and I'd already kind of led with that. And that's the core of the episode. Here, I'll flip perspectives, and we'll move from Germanicus's side of things to the priest's side of things. The priest here who presents these Theban ruins to Germanicus embodies a canonical form of historical memory that is of long-standing historiographic significance. And as I think as many of you are already thinking, this is something that goes back to Herodotus. And in fact, the attention paid to the resonances with Herodotus in this passage are so thorough. And you know, a lot of folks like Chris Pelling and Tony Woodman, Eleanor Gorman, Benjamin Kelly too, most recently, I think, have all spent time discussing the Herodotus overtones here. I'm not going to belabor them, but I will note Herodotus's clear alignment of priestly knowledge over the past with the kind of investigation that constitutes historia. Instead, the prototypical function of priestly authority in Herodotus should give way, and will give way, today at least, to the specific constitution of the priest figure under the Principate. And much more important for my argument here, and much less frequently discussed, is the sustained engagement here with Book 10 of Lucan's Bellum Cavila. And just to prove that I'm not making these Lucan resonances up, Timothy Joseph has wrote broadly and very persuasively, I think, for Tacitus's direct engagement with the mixed historian poet, Lucan. Book 10 of the Bellum Cavila contains a natural philosophical interlude that's similar in some ways to Germanicus's tourism in Tacitus. In Lucan, Caesar talks with an Egyptian priest, Achareus, about the origins of the Nile. Caesar makes this kind of disingenuous promise to Achareus that if he only knew the Nile sources, he'd be happy to drop his quest for power. But it soon becomes obvious that this natural philosophical knowledge is a proxy for imperial ambition writ large. Achareus, this Egyptian priest, has a privileged knowledge of the Nile sources, one which Caesar is keen for Achareus to divulge. Achareus' speech about the Nile in Lucan becomes a document in how those with authority over the past and over the natural environment accommodate, or should maybe refuse to accommodate, those imperial dynasts who wish to benefit from it. Lucan's Achareus-Caesar debate uses the Egyptian priest format to think about broader contexts of talking to and protreptically guiding those in power. And Elena Manilaraki, and Jonathan Tracy too, for that matter, has offered a persuasive reading of Lucan's Nile digression that sees the Achareus-Caesar relationship as a thinly veiled reference to Lucan's uncle Seneca's instruction of Nero. Like Achareus, Seneca had to manage an intellectually minded but obviously dangerous leader, Nero. Lucan proves that a priest exercises a mode of authority with the elasticity to embody other modes of guidance. And Tacitus is going to use, I suggest, the priest in a similar way, refracting through the priest's visit and his interaction with Germanicus, a self-aware interest in how an historian navigates an imperial audience. This Theban priest has two relationships with those in power. I've already hinted at one, that he's delivering his reading of this monument to Germanicus, a Roman whose position of power over the priest reflects Rome's broader control of Egypt. This priest's reading of the monument needs to shape itself around the imbalance of power that hangs over his interaction with Germanicus. But there's another one, and this priest is also navigating a relationship with those in power in his own culture, namely this Egyptian king, Ramses, the guy who's doing all of this conquering. The subject of the Theban monument is a famous Egyptian king from the New Kingdom, from the 19th dynasty, Ramses II. And while Ramses' military accomplishments are obviously distorted to meet the political geography of the early 1st century, Tacitus does reflect Ramses' actual self-positioning as conqueror in Karnak, which is the Theban temple to the Amun triad. And I've included just as examples, 2 reliefs from the hypostyle hall at Karnak, where Ramses II is representing himself conquering here. He's the guy with the bow, and then also exacting tribute. He's kind of triumphantly marching with a bunch of captured folks behind him. It's harder to see the captured folks. And this is part of Ramses' set of Kadesh inscriptions, which cataloged his victories over the Hittites in West Asia. The focus, oh yeah, sorry, I lost my place for a second. The dynamics of the Ramses priest relationship also deserves attention, right? Ramses matters too, it's not just about Germanicus. The focus on people conquered and the tribute exacted echoes Roman forms of imperial self-expression, right? How does Ramses' deeds kind of look? It's very formulaically about places that you conquer, and it's about kind of a tribute that you get and wealth that you accrue because of that conquest, and the institutions that benefit in Egypt because of it, right? The places like the temples that get stuff. Formally, then, this text is, as others have pointed out, I'm not the first to see this, kindred with monumental res gestae. And there's going to be one important one, Augustus's, the res gestae divi Augusti, which I've pictured here, right on the outside of the Areopagus Museum. The kind of historical record that the priest represents to Germanicus hews closely to the way that Augustus presented himself and his accomplishments. It is generically kindred. But even as the priest's reading of the text closely imitates the forms of aggrandizement that res gestae contained, one must still pause to appreciate that the priest here has the final and uncontestable authority over this imperial monument. So that in Tacitus's configuration, the records of a dynast will, over time, increasingly rely and be dependent on the authority of those whose task it is to present them to a new audience. There is a specific set of vocabulary that underwrites this authority of the priest over Ramses' list of accomplishments. The act of reading that the priest undertakes here is not simple or straightforward. It creates space for processes of interpretation that substantiate his historiographic authority. And the episode concatenates interrelated historiographic verbs. First, we get interpretari, and that occupies a prominent position at the head of the passage. In a very basic way, the priest is needed because he's going to translate between 2 languages, between Egyptian and Greek. Narrowly, this translation is on the level of a linguistic level, rendering Egyptian into Greek. But the specific choice of interpretari suggests that there is a broader form of cultural translation here, one that brings Egyptian conventions of historiographic self-expression into their Roman equivalents, namely res gestae. In the second place, we have referebat, one that turns to a common historiographic mode of narration. And I won't cite it for time, but Tacitus uses in Book 4 referebat specifically in the context of discussing about annalistic historiography. It's a kind of generically specific kind of narration. These different verbs coordinate the different processes that constitute a dynamic translation of Egyptian into a form that is of particular value to Germanicus. The fact that this source text is in Egyptian, and more specifically in the hieroglyphic script, creates 2 forms of mediation. The first is this synchronic one between languages, right? Moving something from Egyptian into Greek. But the specific resonances of hieroglyphic make clear that the priest is also a mediator who bridges the present and the past. And it is the second form of translation that paints this priest in specifically historiographic colors. The access to the past provided by hieroglyphic had been a regular association that was made by Roman authors, including Tacitus himself later in the Annales. In Book 11, Tacitus pauses to take the opportunity to give an historical overview of letters, of written letters. And he does this to explain the Emperor Claudius's decision to add 3 letters to the Latin alphabet. And Egyptians are the first one mentioned in this kind of overarching history of the letter. It was the Egyptians who first gave written form to ideas using representations of animals. These are the most ancient documents in the history of mankind and are still to be seen engraved on stones. Tacitus takes the hieroglyphic script as the source not only just of letters, but of the whole enterprise of commemorating and monumentalizing the past. The ea antiquissima monumenta memoriae humanae impressa soxis, right? This regular association of hieroglyphic with monumental inscription, the fact that these end up on stones, fossilizes a commemorative function that brings this general issue of semiotics, right? Writing things down in the kind of Plato's Phaedrus mode, into connection with the core Thucydidean metaphor of history as its own kind of monument. The specific issue of obliteration, which is woven into this passage in Book 11, creates a threat of obsolescence that hieroglyphs were always amazingly able to withstand. And in this regard, Tacitus contrasts hieroglyphs' longevity with Claudius's 3 Latin letters, right, at the very end of this passage. And these 3 letters are quickly forgotten. They don't stand the test of time at all. Tacitus himself points out hieroglyphs' continuation into the present, that they're visible, right? They're still engraved on stones. Their unparalleled ability to withstand the devastations of time make them a particularly fruitful and ultimately optimistic metonymic association to make with history as a similar monumental act of preservation. The Theban visit suppresses any threat of language change. And there's never any sense that Ramses's and the priest's sermones are not one and the same, right? Immediately we think that they're speaking the same language here. This unspoken continuity of language forms a sleight of hand, one that relocates the near impossible preservation of these hieroglyphs. What is remarkable is not so much the continued presence of these hieroglyphs on near ruined monuments. It is instead the continued availability of a priest who will be able to read it for Germanicus's benefit. That kind of preservation of knowledge is not subject to the same kind of material ruination as the monuments themselves. And at least in this passage's construction, the monuments may be crumbling, but the availability of a priest to read them is unproblematic and easily depended on. Right? It's the kind of logical assumptions of this passage that you can get your hands on a priest to read this that I'm trying to draw attention to, away from the louder ruination kind of motif. It's important to note with O'Gorman the slippage that occurs in the end of the passage. Right? These were all no less impressive than the duties now levied by the might of Parthia or the power of Rome. The narrator explicitly compares the amount of tribute amassed by Ramses to that gathered by Roman Parthia, so that it becomes unclear who's actually delivering this comparison. There's been nothing to obviously punctuate this priest's narrative, even as the material obviously is zoomed out and beyond the monument itself. And so that as a result, there's a moment of alignment that blurs together the priest's and Tacitus's own historiographic voices. As the priest's speech reaches its conclusion, its own status as a meta-historiographic exercise becomes clearer. The priest's interpretation of this Theban monument, translated into a frame of res gestae, obviously legible to Germanicus, concludes by subsuming Tacitus's own overarching narrative voice, or perhaps vice versa. Tacitus's self-conception as an author and the way that that's laid out in the preface to the Annales invites this kind of comparison and parallels the imagined relationship between priest and monument. This is well known, but I'll read it anyway. The Roman people of old had their successes and their failures related by famous authors, and there was no shortage of fine minds for recording the Augustan period until the groundswell of obsequiousness frightened them off. The histories of Tiberius, Gaius, Claudius, and Nero were distorted because of fear while they reigned, and when they were gone, were composed with animosities still fresh. Hence my decision to deal only briefly with Augustus, and specifically with the final days, and then to move on to the Principate of Tiberius and its aftermath, without rank or bias, far removed as I am from motives for these. Tacitus suggests that distance is the key prerequisite for the type of balanced historical interpretation that he values. And under the Julio-Claudians, one couldn't write an adequate history. Right? Things were too much dictated by either obsequiousness or animosity. Tacitus's temporal remove from the events in question is the only guarantor of his own proper historiographic authority over the Principate. This temporal distance, this posteriority, is famously repackaged as a distance from the kind of bias and the kind of emotion that undermines proper historiography. And this is relatively well known in this habeo procol. Right? I hold the causes for those kind of emotions far away. So, like the priest, Tacitus is occupying a mediating position that is at once dependent on a distance and a posteriority that makes its own authority safe, but is still closely enough connected to the events in question to guarantee the commemoration and the commemoration of the events in question, and to ward off any threat of obliteration. And just to kind of continue in this vein, the histories which Tacitus had already written by the time the Annales come along, it already makes clear these risks about writing under the Principate. Critically, I won't belabor this. The group that is disadvantaged by this kind of twin biases of either really needing to suck up to the emperors or just being really spiteful of them is posterity. Right? Between the hostility of the one class and the servility of the other, posterity was disregarded. And through this allusion to posterity, Tacitus returns to a common monumental conceptualization of history writing, right? History writing as a possession for eternity, which is the Thucydidean. Only through Tacitus's remove from the events in question can you write a work that will truly benefit posterity. Importantly, in Tacitus's here and now, under the better times offered by Nerva and Trajan, things are better, right? The rare good fortune of an age in which we may feel what we wish and may say what we feel. So like the idealized picture of Germanicus, Tacitus's rosier version of his own time suggests that there might be in the future a group that can listen to the historiographic narrative that Tacitus is going to be presenting. So to recap and to bring us towards our conclusion, I have then suggested that the priest's presentation of Egypt's past for the benefit of Germanicus forms a template for Tacitus, the emperors he catalogs, and his dimly, but still partially imagined audience. The bridge between the priests and Tacitus's authority continues even as Germanicus travels to other sites, even after Thebes. Germanicus, however, had his attention focused on other wonders too. This is the end of the visit. Foremost among these were the stone figure of Memnon that emitted the sound of a voice when struck by the rays of the sun, the pyramids that, because of the rivalry of wealthy kings, were erected like monuments amidst the shifting and barely passable sands, a lake sunk in the ground to receive the overflow of the Nile, and elsewhere narrow gorges and river depths that none can plumb. After that, he came to Elephantine and Syene. These formerly represented the limits of the Roman Empire, which now extends as far as the Red Sea. It's important to clarify that geographically, these sites are all over the map. And this is a really scenic route. So we're in Thebes down here first, then we go up here to the pyramids, then we go to Lake Moeris, that kind of lake to receive the Nile. We don't really know what he means by these depths, but he's probably talking about the cataracts, or at least down here. And finally, we end up at Elephantine at the border. In other words, Tacitus is deliberately creating a warped itinerary in order to postpone the pyramids until after Thebes. The range of sites visited in this section provide a specific model of imperial ambition that's articulated through meddling with and attempting to master the natural environment. And here, the warped geography calls particular attention to the pyramids. These pyramids that, because of the rivalry of wealthy kings, were erected. Tacitus's particular description of pyramids, his emphasis on them as a monument to wasteful and unproductive rivalry, is echoing Pliny the Elder. And Pliny the Elder also really doesn't like pyramids. In Egypt too are the pyramids, which must be mentioned, if only cursorily. They rank as a superfluous and foolish display of wealth on the part of the kings, since it is generally recorded that their motive for building them was to avoid providing funds for their successors or for rivals who wished to plot against them. Pliny presents pyramids as a sign of the decline that comes with a rivalrous approach to imperial succession. Egypt's iconic monuments become a paradigm of one-upsmanship. And to Pliny, this rivalrousness is also taken up by Roman dynasts. They too, like Egyptian kings, participate in the same kind of wasteful, self-destructive wrangling. Particularly, Roman emperors' importation of Egyptian monuments perpetuates the rivalry that gave those monuments birth in the first place. And in this general framework of monumental rivalry, the importation of obelisks is particularly important. When obelisks move from Egypt to Rome, the rivalrousness travels with them. And I won't belabor this, but Pliny spent a long time talking glowingly of Augustus's 2 imported obelisks. It's an amazing, absolutely miraculous feat. And then immediately afterwards, he talks about the 3rd one. The 3rd obelisk in Rome stands in the Vatican Circus that was built by the emperors Gaius and Nero. It was the only one of the 3 that was broken during its removal. In other words, Pliny is not so impressed by these post-Augustan obelisks. Like other aspects of the Egypt visit, the topos of inter-rivalry here looks to the immediate narrative context of the Annales, which proves that this kind of rivalry is hanging over Germanicus even if he doesn't realize it. Immediately before Egypt, Germanicus had been quarreling with Gnaeus Piso, something that's going to segue immediately into Germanicus's death. More broadly, the description of the pyramids looks to the kind of rivalry between Germanicus and Tiberius that is the framework for books 1 to 2. And beyond just Germanicus, these pyramids and the fact that Pliny and Tacitus both present rivalrous readings of them gives precedent to the overall structure of the Annales, which shows just how central this kind of intergenerational rivalry is to the progression of emperors that constitutes the Annales. Early in the text, Tacitus demonstrates the fundamental importance of rivalry as an analytic for emperors' actions. And already in Augustus's will, right, really at the beginning of the Annales, it's clear that there's a sense of rivalry being established among his successors. So Augustus had listed everything in his own handwriting and had added the recommendation through fear, perhaps, or from jealousy, that the empire be restricted to its existing frontiers. As is typical, Tacitus concludes Augustus's indirect speech with a final historiographic interpolation. He adds the incerta metu on per invidiam. And invidiam is essential and highlighted because it's the last word, right? Jealousy. It's about jealousy. Through these alternate explanations, Tacitus makes clear that the successional rivalry, it was always a part of the Principate from its beginnings. Really properly to bring this to a conclusion, the visit is going to end at the southern border of Egypt in Elephantine, right? After that, he came to Elephantine and Syene. These formerly represented the limits of the Roman Empire, which now extends as far as the Red Sea. And as Germanicus reaches the southern border, Tacitus allows himself a proleptic look to the future of the Roman state, which stretches beyond its current borders. This proleptic gesture to Trajan and to Tacitus's present is affected by this programmatic nunc. And as Günther Wille has suggested, this is one of the few moments in which Tacitus really flags his own present and inserts it into the narrative. And in doing so, the lessons learned by Germanicus aren't just framed by their historical setting, right? By the fact that Germanicus can't compete with the forces of the Principate. They're also framed by the promise of the future and the ambivalent tone with which Tacitus discusses this expansion. And just to kind of put this on the map, we're originally kind of having the southern border with Germanicus's visit at Elephantine, and under Trajan, it extends farther south here to Hera Sicaminus. So it's no accident, in other words, that this momentary glimpse of a long slope of posteriority ironically proves Augustus's fears right. Augustus's own encouragement to limit Rome's borders can't compete with the kind of territorial expansion which secures glory. But that expansion in its inevitability had already been learned by Germanicus, who had seen that Ramses had gained a monumental immortality by exactly this kind of territorial expansion. There's a wrinkle here, one that I'm suggesting enriches the image of ruination that presents this episode as a story of decline in the succession of empires. Others have noted well that this Theban ruin imagines a time when the glory of Rome's emperors crumbles to dust. And so that this Egypt-Rome succession of empires motifs is going to basically underline a Wheel of Fortune motif that was long historians' bread and butter. Putting simply, this Egyptian stuff is a spin on the variability of fame that underlines the preface to Herodotus's histories. The temporal shift to Herodotus is here and now that expands the historical time within the episode's purview. And by zooming out, in the context of recurrent images of ruination, this shows the inadequacy of political time against the natural time that will affect these monuments' degradation. Right? In other words, Augustus can't compete with the longer arc of the first century. And the longer arc of the first century can't compete with the sands of time. But I want to emphasize today that there remains in the episode an underappreciated countercurrent. This monument in its presentation to Germanicus by an Egyptian priest offers a surprisingly optimistic portrait of how historiographic authority can endure despite that monument's ruination. There's still a priest who can relay the lessons of that past to those in the present who can benefit from it. Right? Nature's inevitable ruination brings down political monuments, but it elevates those who survive to present those ruined monuments to future generations. Right? An emperor's loss is an historian's gain, who's always going to end up with the final say over things. The whole episode in its conclusion aggrandizes the point of view that Tacitus, like the priest, can claim. Tacitus's authorial gaze can survey all the way to the Red Sea and can project onto it the sweep of history from Ramses to the present. And the decline and ruination located in Egypt and so obviously descriptive of the Principate's imagined future is the stuff on which Tacitus's monumental historiography will be built. And while the priest's idealized audience, Germanicus, soon dies, there remains the prospect that somebody will eventually come along who can benefit from Tacitus's translation of his own ruler's actions. Thanks. Try my chat.
Thank you very much to Edward for this brilliant paper. Before we have talked about some conclusion by Giovanni Cecconi, is this the time or later? What do you think, Ed?
I think that we'll do the questions and then Giovanni can do the conclusion when the questions are exhausted.
Perfect. There is a question by Johannes Engels. So I give the word to Johannes.
I cannot start my video, but perhaps you can hear my voice.
Yeah.
Okay. I was thinking about a close parallel to this precise visit journey report of Germanicus then, and it's only about 30 years earlier that a member of the Eastern elite of pro-Roman intellectuals, the geographer and historian Strabo, made a visit to Egypt, and he left a quite detailed report upon his journey, which in several instances meets very well with the report in Tacitus then, for instance, on Thebes and the southern frontier of Egypt and other places. Now, of course, this is coming from the tradition of a literary, educated Eastern member of the honoratiores class then, but a pro-Roman writer. Would you think that we could gain anything to see even more clearly the specific Roman and Tacitean accents in his report by a comparison with Strabo's notes? Just I came up to this idea when I heard your remarks on Thebes. For instance, on Thebes, Tacitus acknowledges that the priest mentioned the vast armies and the military victories, etc., etc. But in Strabo, the emphasis is more on the Herodotean tradition, on the literary monuments, and things like that. So perhaps you could give your opinion on that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with the kind of, Strabo is an essential kind of absence here because he's going to make particular, the way that Tacitus's version of this is very particular and not inevitable. And if you end up in Thebes, there's a lot of kind of not military greatness expansion stuff that you would talk about. And the kind of Egypt as a place that kind of conquered other people, you know, it's there in Herodotus and it continues in Strabo, but it's mostly a Sesostris thing, right? Sesostris kind of goes to other places, but that's not as important to, you know, the Herodotean Greek and then Strabonic tradition as, for example, like city founding Strabo's kind of perspective on Egypt is often one of kind of, in my mind, one of naturalizing empire, so that Egypt is a kind of test run in some ways of all the stuff that Rome will be able to perfect, right? And to my mind, that's kind of particular because he's only able to travel around Egypt literally with the Roman prefect, right? He's traveling at Roman's behest. So that's a kind of Tacitian kind of world weariness that comes with viewing Egypt, like everything is just kind of faded awfulness, is not the way that Strabo sees things, right? He sees as a kind of more productive version of kind of oecumenical connections to Homer, right? That's a kind of exciting thing that he sees on the ground, things that remind him of Homer, and that's kind of exciting rather than kind of empires come and go-ish. So I see Strabo as productive because he doesn't have the kind of weariness with the Principate lens onto Egypt that we see in Tacitus. And I think you need Strabo in order to see that that kind of world-weary lens is very particular to why this is occurring in the Annales, rather than another kind of more standard, say, periegetic text.
Yeah, thank you.
There is a comment by Giovanni Cecconi.
Thank you, Edward. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It's not a comment, maybe it's also a question. Would you say that Tacitus describes Egypt as in decline? I mean, because Egypt lives in its past, but at the same time, this past is very vital. There is a vitality in this past. And there is also a present, I mean, the economical importance of Egypt for the Roman Empire. From a political point of view, I would say that we can build a periodization of the Egyptian decline. The great Egypt is pharaonic Egypt, Ramses the second Egypt. And then after Alexander, I would say that there is a strong Egypt in the 4th century at the end of the 4th and the 3rd century, because Egypt wins wars against Syria. But from the beginning of the 2nd century, Egypt, with all its dynastic quarrels and political internal problems, becomes weak and goes under the Roman influence. And this is a progressive decline from a political point of view. A progressive decline until the Egyptocapta, until the end of its independence as a state. So it's a strange decline. It's a political decline, but a cultural and I would say in the common image, it's difficult to speak of an Egyptian decline also during the Roman Empire.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think there are two avenues I would take that in. One would be, in a basic way, when you read Tacitus's Theban visit, it doesn't seem like there's anybody around except for Germanicus and a priest that they managed to bring around, right? It seems like a kind of no place, right? There's nothing going on there, which is this kind of decline model. But if you look demographically, Egypt is incredibly populous and vibrant. So it would be easy to imagine, based on Tacitus, that there's nobody who actually lives there anymore, right? It's just a kind of ghost town. That's the kind of impression that you get. But in point of fact, am I blurred, or is that just Giovanni? I want to make sure folks are hearing me. Am I audible? Just a kind of a yes in the chat.
You're good.
Oh, great. Okay, so I don't know if Giovanni can hear me, but anyway, there's a sense that demographically it could be just kind of really nobody there, and from the perspective of this visit, when it's really vibrant. I mean, there are a huge number of people there. Egypt cities are bigger than pretty much any other cities around. And even kind of in a demographic sense, a city like Thebes, like a known metropolis, which otherwise would be unremarkable, is really, really populous. So this decline is kind of a fickle thing. It's not historic, like on the groundness of that decline is not necessarily borne out. The other element, my response to the kind of particular like 2nd and 1st century BCE Egypt, which is really important because Romans know that Egypt only exists because Romans meddle enough to protect it, right? That kind of thread that you were pointing to, Giovanni. It's interesting, and I haven't pursued it that kind of thoroughly. I mean, I like the idea of there being a kind of, Tacitus is viewing Egypt with the knowledge of the kind of Republican interventions in Egypt, right? That's kind of hanging there, that Romans had already been involved in the late Republic propping Egypt up, right? So that Egypt is not just a way of talking about the Augustus moment, but it's also a way of kind of reimagining all of these Republican Romans who kind of parade around the East. Right? That's kind of hinted at in the Aemilius Paulus comparison that Woodman makes, but I think you could build it out in terms of specifically through the way that Rome is, the way that Republican Rome is positioned against these places in a way that is kind of really historically bounded by the way that things develop in the Principate. Right? They're kind of being a kingmaker in the East. It has a brief moment that could be here, right? That kind of moment of Egypt could be hanging out here. I haven't, that's kind of more off the cuff. I haven't pursued that angle, but I think it could be productive.
Thank you.
There is a question by Mira Balberg first, and then by Picham.
Hey, Ted, thank you for a really wonderful talk, so well delivered and so rich. I wanted to ask a little bit about the aspect of nature, and specifically apropos the resonance with Lucan that you mentioned briefly, but that was so evocative. Because in a sense, there's something about those sort of the sands of time, the ruin that comes about just because everything is ultimately to be ruined. And I was wondering if you see any resonance with Lucan's descriptions, primarily like of North Africa.
Yeah, like the Book 9 stuff, like, know.
The serpents and,
yeah,
you know.
Like Cato ending up in this weird kind of temple in the middle of nowhere. Like you would think that it's just a nowhere whole thing. Yeah.
So, could you say something about basically perhaps sort of North Africa and those desert regions as regions that are sort of defined by something that is almost nefarious, almost dangerous, something that is ultimately eliminating everything, both people and time and monuments? This connection is interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, a traditional kind of, let's say, orthodoxic answer would kind of point in the direction of Seneca's Naturales Quaestiones, which is going to kind of hang over Luke in Book 10, where you get a very stoic point of view about what nature is productive for in terms of expanding your consciousness, right? A kind of, you can see farther and see time in a more capacious way when you think about stuff like the Nile, or you spend time in deserts. And Cato's time in Book 9 is going to be all about that, because time doesn't really, if you track the kind of passage of time in Book 9, things get really weird. It kind of is geographically and temporally, things kind of bend out of shape. And when Cato's trying to make it west, right? When he's crossing this desert, it doesn't track, which is a very kind of stoic kind of thing where you get a kind of cosmic point of view. And Cato is becoming an even more larger than life figure through traipsing the desert, right? Which is often a kind of traipsing the desert motif, right? Deserts in particular are a way of kind of, it is one of many forms of kind of conquest, right? And it's kind of getting really monumentally large.
Yeah.
So the desert one is particular there. The other one that's, I haven't built out in this talk, but is definitely there, is famously trying to figure out the origins of the Nile. Is just the big one. In terms of, and that could be done philosophically in the kind of, let's say Seneca Naturales Quaestiones 4a is about the Nile and its sources, but also is very imperial, right? So it's, marching up the Nile with people to try to figure it out. And all of the people like Sesostris and then Cambyses, and then, you get Romans like Augustus, and his Nero also is kind of important because he tries, but doesn't necessarily succeed in sending an expedition up the Nile. with the Praetorian prefect. So you can take it in both directions, right? Nature can be either kind of a philosophical category or it could be a kind of imperial category, depending on what you want to do with it.
And then there will be a whole other afterlife in early Christianity.
Oh yeah, I'm sure the kind of going to the desert thing, you know, and when you move more into a late antique will be, yeah, those categories will be, you know, I would defer to you all on that, but that continuity, I you know, would see to be there.
Thank you.
There is a question by P. Chan.
Yeah, yes. First of all, I want to say that I'm not an Egyptologist or even a historian, but I was very interested in the concept of time that you introduced, because as long as you have the priest who has an understanding of history from a particular point of view, he is able to, in a way, transcend not only the struggle between generations, but also even in a sense, the monument themselves, because even if the erosion of sand over the monuments, there will still be, in a sense, I could say a kind of a historical perspective, love in the ruins, even, it lasts beyond that. And it's just, but however, he also mentioned how it is important for the tour guide, in this case, the historian, I suppose, of a certain type, must also be responsive to the audience, as well as, and how that response must be mediated within the relationship of the original history from his perspective. But isn't there a problem with that in the sense, in terms of time? Because as time goes on, the presumption is that this priestly class, or this priest, continues to stand in stern watch over the original history, even though it's mediated. Wouldn't that itself also be eroded through history, just as the sands will erode the monument themselves? So eventually that history would be worn down to the, because it has to be respond to the audience, worn down also to a ruin. So how is history in that sense able to transcend, in a sense, even beyond the monuments? Because history itself also degrades as much as the ruins themselves.
I think I follow you. I think, for my mind, the most productive path toward an answer is appreciating the specific circumstances of the Annales versus the Historia, versus the histories. Where basically, the Annales is a later text, and it's very self-aware in that regard, right? He writes it later, but it's about earlier material in the Principate. And in that regard, I think of Tacitus as having a self-aware kind of retrospectiveness that comes with going earlier than the stuff he had done originally and having outlived a lot of the stuff that made his life very unpleasant earlier in his career, right? So to my mind, this version of historiography, and I agree with your caveat that, you know, nothing can survive eventually, nothing could bear that kind of scrutiny. So I'll acknowledge it, absolutely. Then I think what's more productive is a way in which Tacitus is underlining his own kind of posteriority in the way that it is something that underlines in every facet of the Annales the way that he views his own relationship to this material, right? To Tiberius in particular. There's really a laterness that he's aware of in books 1 to 2. And if you read the Annales, the proleptic gestures, like this is going to be the origin story of this, I mean, it's all over the place. It really, you can't help but doing that. And that speaks to the kind of surviving this stuff, right? That I've been trying to call attention to. So the brief is that I agree that historiographic monumentality, you know, can't endure forever, but I think it's a helpful kind of analytical tool because it shines a light on how Tacitus is kind of celebrating his own posteriority, right? That's a thing that he views as a benefit to the text that he produces.
Thank you.
Okay. Enrico Magnelli said bye to everybody. And there is a question by my colleague, Veronica Bucciantini. Veronica?
I think you might be muted.
Sorry. Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Barbara, and thank you very much, Ted Kelting, for this very, very interesting lecture. I enjoy it, and I have a curiosity, only a little question. I enjoyed most of all these geographical aspects of these very interesting reconstruction of with Tacitus and so on, and Pliny. And I have I can say a sensation. First of all, I agree with Professor Engels and with this Strabo Egypt point of view. But I want to ask, for my opinion, the idea of the most important city of Egypt and the most important, if I may say, landmarks of Egypt in these sources are not updated, but are important name that comes from a century before. For example, Siene, and it's a clear Eratosthenical source. And this very interesting trip of Germanicus seems, but it's only my idea, I want to ask to you, seems a tour in the most traditional landmarks of Egypt, not a really tour where he wanted to go. I don't know if I was clear.
Yeah, no, I think that a sense of, it's important to read geographers, and I've only done a drive-by kind of nod toward Pliny the Elder, but you could really make the same point, and Professor Engels did with Strabo, that it's important to read how geographers move around Egypt and what they spend time with to realize how this is a literary tour and not a kind of on-the-ground one, and that's really pretty significant for underwriting this episode, right? So as a kind of basic rule of thumb, Alexandria and the geographers is remarkable and exists in kind of, it's a huge object of attention, as is Memphis, right? So you get a lot of stuff in the geographers that is not going to suit Tacitus's purposes at all, right? So he doesn't do anything with that. Instead, he kind of offers up a version that is in deliberate contrast with a proper kind of route around Egypt. And to me, that makes it even clearer, and it gives me more license to suggest that Tacitus then is doing something with this. It's not a kind of, there's not a sense that you need to end up, like if you read Ptolemy, like with a map, there's not a kind of that's not a demand of his work. And there's not a kind of overarching geographic framework like you get in, say, Strabo, or even, in books like 4 to 6 of Pliny. There's not a kind of raison d'etre in terms of cataloging the Ecumene correctly, which means to me that it's more interesting because it's one, deeply anachronistic and kind of purposefully so. There's nothing about the kind of geographer's point of view around Egypt that is kind of underwriting this. And paying attention to how non-geographic kind of authors create space is really important because it's constructed for a literary argument, right? And it's fun to point on the map to suggest that you would go to Elephantine from Thebes via Giza, because that makes no sense whatsoever. That's a kind of a very lighthearted approach to a bigger sense of kind of how you stitch together space in a literary journey, rather than a kind of a one that suggests that you need a map at the end of it, which is an important framework. The other kind of, this is not an answer to your question, Veronica, but I was going to ask you about it last time and I didn't. So I'll bring it up.
Oh my God.
I won't ask you a question of you, but the pragmaticness that Tacitus is assigning the role of the priest, it reminds me a lot of the preface to Strabo and the idea that geography is of value to those in power, right? There's a kind of pragmatism to this geographic authority, right? That folks in power can benefit from this. And that kind of, I pointed to the like elasticity of this kind of authority, and I think you could even pull it a little bit farther for kind of intellectual genres that are pragmatic, right? Namely that they help those in power. Which gets back to Professor Engel's point about kind of that Strabo is producing this map of Egypt because he's traveling around with an army, right? That's not nothing in terms of how geographic knowledge is positioned against Romans having power over these places.
Thank you so much. I propose to write you an email and maybe take contact and we can discuss by email.
We don't need to bore everybody with the geographers, but I could talk more about geographers, till the cows come home.
Thank you very much. I make sure. So thank you.
Thank you. Are there more questions or comments or? Oh, I have a comment, Ted. I just want to propose you a literary text. Maybe you already know it from my literary point of view, from the Augustan Age and Tibullus Elegy 1:7.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting text because in this text, Tibullus celebrates the birthday of Messalla.
In such a weird way, in a way that you wouldn't anticipate necessarily.
Yeah, and also his triumph on the Aquitans. But what actually happens in the elegy is a surprising description of a proper tour in the East, in which Messalla took an important role as well, of course. And then there is an amazing arrive as in a tour, as in a trip to Egypt. And there is a description of course, the greatness of the place, of the Nile. And the scholars, historians about scholars as me, are divided because some thinks to an anti-Augustan peace because this peace, it would support Egypt and it would be against the current anti-Egyptian Augustan ideology. Some, this is my opinion as well, believes that Tibullus uses Egypt in connection to Messalla in order to, I don't know if I'm clear, but to make peace with Augustus, break with Egyptus. It is a kind of rehabilitation of the decadent Egypt. I think this is a very interesting for your point as well. Then Tibullus formulates a nod to Dionysus in syncretistic connection with Osiris. But this is an amazing text. It opens many perspectives. It is only a text I would like to propose you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big one is that you can kind of present a version of Osiris and his Dionysiac connections as a kind of bringer of peace, right? This kind of let's drink strain of Augustan poetry as a kind of gesture toward moving past and of making peace. It's obviously kind of using Osiris in that, inserting Osiris into that kind of a tradition where Osiris maybe hasn't, until Tibullus put him there, belonged. I agree with your reading that it is kind of suggesting that Egypt can have a kind of ideological role in turning the page that it hadn't yet, right? And in particular there, I mean, I don't have the text in front of me, but I think in some ways there is a kind of the tour guide, so to speak, the person who's telling the role, it's like ISIS or something, is it? We need to cut it up. There's a kind of form of indirect speech where basically Egypt has a kind of authority that is presented to Messalla. And it's kind of, it's interesting to me that it kind of is expanding the kind of topological or ideological associations you can make with Egypt, even in the kind of Augustan moment, right? Like the kind of Agupta Capta or the Aeneid 8 kind of stuff. It's not the only kind of way to use Egypt to kind of deal with this moment and its kind of challenges. that there are other things you can do. And putting the Osiris as kind of peacemaker on the map as kind of one of these associations, or the kind of the way that the Ovid's Metamorphoses also kind of create space for new ideological associations made with Egypt, right? I think it's an important gesture, right? One that suggests that it's not just about the kind of the Cleopatra ode template or any kind of schematic and kind of us on this side. We are us because we're not these kind of Cleopatra types or this kind of, we're not these Egyptians, is not the be all and end all from a Roman point of view. Right? Particularly, this is a final tag I'll add on it, but the fact that Isis religion is a big deal in elegy in a basic way, right? There's a lot going on in terms of Isis religion and Tibullus and also Propertius, right? So that's something that's there. And just because the Augustus and Tiberius don't want to have anything to do with Isis religion doesn't mean that it's not an important space for dealing with Egypt in an every day on the groundness as elegists in Rome, right? That it is not a part of kind of Roman literary urbanity.
Yeah. Thank you very much. For me, it's very interesting because I'm dealing with the Bacchic topic. Also,
Yeah. That alignment is weird. The fact that you know you can talk about Osiris in connection to Bacchus just opens things up in a way that a lot of Roman authors would rather it not be opened up. Let's say it's just a different avenue than they want.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I don't want to take so much time for me. Are there more questions by students as well? I see many students of our classes in Florence. Maybe because of the English, it's not so easy for us to give questions, but
yeah, I'm around. So feel free to email me.
Yeah, just for the students, you can send an email to Ted if you have curiosities as well. Because if there are no questions, maybe I would give the word to Giovanni Cecconi for his conclusions. I say thank you again to Ted for his very brilliant paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Ed. They are not conclusions. I just try to. Can you see the poster? Just few final words. I thank all the participants in today's brilliant lecture by Ted Kelting, and I want to give us an appointment, a date for July 2 for the lecture by our Florence colleague Carlos Lavic. Will speak to us from a particular angle of on decline, that is the angle of epigraphic habit. And I think I exchanged some reflections with him and about the landscape of epigraphy and honorary statuary in the cities of the 3rd century empire. And this should be the theme. I think, I don't know if Carlo is here, but I think this is his theme. And then we will be together again on July 18 for a lecture by our friend and colleague Michel Salzman. But of course, we will talk about it again. And so it will be very hot in Florence, in California, but in this case, I imagine we will be sitting with air conditioning and somehow in the cool. And anyway, greetings to all and have a nice day, have a nice evening, and to the next time.